Some punishments were so severe that their echoes reached far beyond the walls of castles and courts. In the quiet of a candlelit hall, a judge might read a sentence that would haunt not just the convicted, but entire communities. The ink on parchment carried more than words. It carried authority, fear, and a warning. In royal Britain, punishment was not merely about law. It was about power, control, and the visible demonstration of both. Even centuries later, the surviving records allow us to glimpse a world where obedience was enforced in ways that modern eyes find almost unimaginable. Yet, to those who lived under the crown, these sentences were not extraordinary. They were the rhythm of life, the predictable outcome of defiance, and the unmistakable mark of the monarch's reach. To understand these measures, one must journey back to the medieval courts of England, where law and authority were inseparable. From the time of William the Conqueror, the monarchy sought to assert control over a fractured land. Royal officers traveled across counties, carrying writs and summoning those accused of crimes. The heavy boots of sheriffs echoed through stone corridors. The scratch of quills recorded verdicts in meticulous detail. These were not idle notes. They were permanent records, binding for all who were named. The law was both sword and seal, and punishment was its demonstration. It was in this world that the first seeds of what later historians called the worst punishments of royal Britain took root. One of the earliest forms of severe sanction was outlawry. A declaration that a person was outside the king's protection meant more than loss of freedom. It erased legal existence. Anyone could attack the outlaw with impunity. Their property could be seized, and families were often left destitute. Documents from Henry II's reign describe men and women declared outlaws for debts, disobedience, or minor offenses that threatened social order. To modern sensibilities, this might seem disproportionate, yet it reflected a deep principle. The crown's peace was absolute, and those who defied it ceased to exist legally. Public humiliation also became a cornerstone of royal justice. Stocks and pillories, placed prominently in town squares, forced offenders into prolonged exposure. Chroniclers note that merchants paused their work, children clutched the hands of their parents, and the convicted endured the relentless gaze of neighbors. Beyond physical discomfort, the punishment worked on reputation, which in a tightly knit community could be devastating. The law understood that fear and shame traveled faster than any sword. By the late medieval period, the laws surrounding treason crystallized the harshest principles of royal authority. To betray the monarch was to challenge not only a person, but the divine order itself. Punishments were multi-layered and symbolic. Property confiscation, public display, imprisonment, and in some cases, death. Every aspect carried meaning. Even the route a condemned person took through town was designed to be visible, deliberate, and memorable. The public nature of justice ensured that the crown's authority is reinforced in the minds of all witnesses, binding the community to obedience through spectacle. Yet, perhaps most chilling, is how normalized these measures became. For ordinary citizens, witnessing punishments was part of daily life. Children grew up seeing the consequences of fraud, theft, or disloyalty. Merchants discussed the latest sentences alongside news of markets and fairs. Clerks wrote with precision. Sheriffs executed with routine. In royal Britain, cruelty was embedded not as a failure of governance, but as an essential instrument of law. It was not sensational, it was normal. And that normalization laid the groundwork for punishments far more severe in the centuries to come. As the centuries passed, punishment in Britain became increasingly formalized and deliberate, reflecting both the crown's growing authority and its desire to maintain order across a rapidly changing society. By the Tudor era, the legal system had expanded into a complex instrument capable of defining not only crimes, but the very character of those accused. Henry VIII's reign, in particular, marked a turning point. Laws multiplied, and acts that might have been dealt with leniency in earlier times were now elevated to capital offenses. Forgery, theft, and even questioning the king's supremacy could result in sentences designed to leave lasting impressions on communities. The crown sought not merely to punish wrongdoing, but to instill a collective understanding that law was inseparable from royal authority. In the streets of London, chroniclers described the precision with which sentences were executed. Tyburn, the site for public hangings, became infamous not simply for the number of deaths, but for the order and ritual that accompanied them. Crowds assembled hours in advance, not for spectacle alone, but to witness authority being enacted. Vendors sold bread and ale. The rhythm of life continued around the edges of the event. Yet at its center was a deliberate performance of control. A reminder that rebellion and defiance carried consequences not just for individuals, but for the stability of the state. Records from this period emphasize meticulous preparation. The condemned were transported in carts, their procession through town planned to maximize visibility and reinforce the message of obedience. Yet punishment extended beyond the physical. Attainder became a particularly effective tool, allowing Parliament to declare guilt without trial. Land and titles of the condemned reverted to the crown, leaving families destitute and reshaping local power structures. Surviving letters and parliamentary rolls reveal the strategic nature of these acts. They were not improvised. They were calculated to send messages of both deterrence and political realignment. History rarely records the faces of those who suffered, but the parchments themselves serve as silent witnesses to the reach of royal justice. In this way, the crown wielded punishment as both a weapon and a statement. Among the most fascinating practices was the punishment known as gibbeting, in which the body of the condemned was displayed in iron cages at crossroads or riverbanks. This was not intended primarily for the deceased, but for the living. Travelers and villagers were reminded that defiance carried consequences beyond the immediate moment. Letters between officials from the early 1600s describe careful selection of these sites, near markets, along frequently traveled roads, and in locations associated with the crime itself. Even years later, these displays would remain a chilling visual memory, reinforcing obedience through fear long after the act had concluded. Prisons, too, evolved during this period. The Tower of London was emblematic of this change, functioning less as a dungeon and more as an instrument of political control. Incarceration could remove a person from influence without making a martyr of them. Records indicate that visitors and letters were strictly controlled, and that prisoners of note were held under conditions designed to isolate and disempower. In contrast, local jails focused more on short-term punishment, holding offenders until they could be publicly corrected or released under supervision. The combination of public and private measures created a multi-layered system of control, where fear, isolation, and social stigma worked together to enforce the crown's will. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of Tudor punishment lies in the selective exercise of mercy. Elizabeth I, for instance, granted pardons with careful calculation. Correspondence preserved in the National Archives shows that forgiveness was offered on coronation anniversaries, religious observances, or during politically sensitive moments. These acts were as performative as executions, reinforcing the idea that the crown's power extended not only to punishment, but to the grace it could dispense. It was a dual lesson. Obedience ensured survival, and survival itself depended on the favor of the sovereign. The cumulative effect of these measures was profound. Ordinary citizens witnessed a society where laws were strict, punishments visible, and mercy scarce. Fear became habitual, ingrained into social consciousness. In such a world, crime was not only a legal matter, but a moral and political signal. Chroniclers, pamphleteers, and local records all confirm that the presence of punishment, whether public humiliation, imprisonment, or death, was a constant. Shaping behavior and reinforcing the omnipresence of authority. It was not random cruelty, it was a deliberate, organized system designed to sustain the crown's vision of order. As the 17th century dawned, royal punishment in Britain intertwined ever more closely with religion, politics, and social hierarchy. The English Civil War, beginning in 1642, disrupted the notion of a unified monarchy, yet it did little to weaken the machinery of justice. If anything, it intensified scrutiny and control. Authorities now monitored speech, loyalty, and even the appearance of obedience. Letters preserved from this period describe the careful observation of communities, the vigilance over sermons in local churches, and the recording of seemingly trivial acts of dissent. Legal enforcement became not just a reaction to crime, but a proactive instrument to maintain social and political order. Transportation emerged as a form of punishment distinct from execution or imprisonment. Convicts were sent to distant colonies, often in harsh conditions, to remove them from English society entirely. Unlike gibbeting or public hangings, transportation served a dual purpose. It punished the offender while simultaneously reinforcing the Crown's authority over both domestic and colonial spaces. Parliamentary records note that for crimes ranging from theft to political agitation, exile became an increasingly common solution, particularly when death or mutilation might provoke unrest. By the late 1600s, transportation had evolved into a regular component of the penal system, underscoring how punishment could be strategic as well as severe. Yet physical punishment did not disappear. Whipping and branding remained common in towns and parishes, applied for offenses considered morally corrupting or socially disruptive. Parish registers from the period detail instances of repeated offenders, punished not merely for their actions, but for the perceived threat they posed to communal stability. Clerks meticulously recorded dates, names, and methods, often adding notes on attendance or public reaction. The intention was never solely to inflict pain, it was to educate the community, reinforce norms, and prevent repetition. In this sense, punishment was an extension of governance itself, blending legal, moral, and social imperatives. A particularly striking practice persisted in the form of peine forte et dure, applied to those who refused to plead in court. This punishment, involving extreme pressure applied to the body, was not intended simply to extract a plea. It symbolized the power of the legal system over individual autonomy. Surviving court notes reveal the meticulous attention to procedure and the emphasis on public demonstration. Every stage of the punishment reinforced the principle that the law demanded compliance, and that silence or defiance would be met with deliberate, calculated force. The documents emphasize ritual, protocol, and the careful recording of outcomes, an almost bureaucratic cruelty that emphasized authority above all else. Meanwhile, the visual display of punishment remained central to the Crown's message. Public executions, gibbetings, and displays of confiscated property functioned as instruments of memory and warning. Inscriptions and placards described crimes, dates, and the monarch's decree, leaving little ambiguity about the source of authority. Travelers, merchants, and villagers could not avoid these reminders. They were placed at crossroads, markets, and riverbanks, locations where life converged. Letters between sheriffs and crown officials discuss the strategic importance of these locations, revealing that the intent was as much psychological as legal. Punishment in these cases extended its influence far beyond the immediate act. The culmination of these methods, however, was not merely to instill fear, but to reinforce hierarchy. Nobles, clergy, and commoners were all subject to punishment, but the forms differed. Nobles might experience private executions or fines, while commoners faced public corporal punishment. Parliamentary records from the Restoration period illustrate a conscious calibration. Punishment was a tool to maintain not only obedience, but social order. A visible demonstration of power carefully adjusted to class and circumstance. These distinctions reinforced the Crown's supremacy while embedding law deeply into daily life. By the end of the century, the Crown had established a legal culture that balanced visibility, ritual, and strategic mercy. The memory of punishment was as important as the act itself, and chroniclers, legal clerks, and correspondents preserved this reality with painstaking detail. Even when reformers began to question excessive severity, The archives remained a testament to centuries in which punishment shaped society, morality, and governance alike. It was a system designed not only to respond to crime, but to define the parameters of obedience, memory, and power. As Britain moved into the late 17th century, punishment began to reveal the complex intersection between law, society, and psychology. While executions and public displays remained central, the Crown increasingly relied on a combination of fear, ritual, and selective mercy to maintain authority. Clerk's notes from the period show that sentences were meticulously planned, with routes through towns calculated for maximum visibility. Even small offenses were recorded with precision, reflecting a legal culture that prized order above improvisation. In every village and city, ordinary citizens encountered the imprint of royal authority, whether through the threat of imprisonment, the spectacle of gibbeting, or the persistent presence of local officials ensuring compliance with law and custom. One of the most revealing punishments involved the intersection of property and legacy. Forfeiture, whereby estates and possessions of the condemned reverted to the Crown, was used strategically. Parliamentary rolls record countless instances where not only the accused, but also their families suffered consequences, effectively erasing social standing across generations. In some cases, children were denied inheritance, ensuring that the repercussions of crime extended far beyond the individual. This form of punishment demonstrates the Crown's understanding of law as a tool for shaping society, reinforcing obedience not only through immediate consequences, but through the long shadow cast across family and community. Another aspect of punishment during this era was imprisonment as a means of political and social control, rather than purely punitive measure. The Tower of London remained emblematic of this approach, holding prisoners whose removal from society prevented potential uprisings or the dissemination of dissenting ideas. Letters and diaries from prisoners provide insight into the psychological weight of such confinement. Isolation, surveillance, and restricted correspondence were all designed to reinforce authority subtly but profoundly. Prison became not only a place of containment, but a silent statement. The Crown observed, and it remembered. Yet, the most striking records from this period often concern the delicate balance between cruelty and mercy. Monarchs and their officials understood that the visibility of punishment could instill obedience, but that excessive severity risked public sympathy or unrest. Elizabethan and Stuart correspondences show that pardons were often calculated for maximum political effect, granted to loyal subjects or strategically timed to mark coronations, religious festivals, or political reconciliations. Mercy was never accidental. It was a deliberate reinforcement of the Crown's supremacy, a reminder that survival depended upon both obedience and fortune. Even corporal punishments, such as whipping or branding, carried layers of meaning beyond pain. Parish registers frequently note the public attendance at such events, emphasizing communal participation. Chroniclers describe merchants pausing trade, neighbors gathering at town gates, and children witnessing the events as part of their moral education. These moments reinforced social norms, linking law, morality, and spectacle. The severity of the act mattered less than the visible communication of authority. In essence, punishment became theater, deliberate, symbolic, and recorded for posterity. At the same time, the records reflect growing attention to procedure and documentation. Legal clerks meticulously noted every sentence, the conditions of its execution, and the reactions of the populace. Even minor offenses were entered with care, demonstrating that the administration of justice was as much about maintaining records as it was about punishment itself. Archives from this period reveal that these practices were systematic, ensuring continuity and consistency in the enforcement of law. What emerges is a society in which punishment was both instrument and message. It disciplined individuals, shaped communities, and reinforced the omnipresence of royal authority. By the close of the century, Britain's approach to punishment had become an intricate system of control. visibility, and subtle psychological influence. Cruelty was embedded not for spectacle alone, but to communicate law, hierarchy, and consequence. Mercy existed, but it was performative, reinforcing the crown's ultimate power. And the records, carefully maintained over generations, preserve this reality with an eerie clarity. The archives do not judge. They simply testify to centuries in which authority was inseparable from the administration of punishment. As Britain entered the 18th century, the legacy of royal punishment continued to shape both law and society, even as reforms slowly began to emerge. The extreme severity of earlier centuries had left an imprint on the collective consciousness. Public executions, gibbeting, forfeiture, and imprisonment were not simply historical footnotes. They were instruments that had defined the boundaries of obedience, morality, and hierarchy for generations. Archives from this period reveal careful records of sentences, transports, and pardons, illustrating a system that relied on visibility, ritual, and the meticulous application of authority to sustain itself. The crown understood that fear could govern as effectively as law, and that every act of punishment carried a lesson not only for the individual, but for the entire community. The most striking aspect of these punishments lies in their normalization. Ordinary citizens observed these events as part of daily life. Children saw the consequences of dishonesty, fraud, or disloyalty. Merchants and villagers internalized the omnipresence of law. Families experienced the long-reaching effects of forfeiture or imprisonment. Chroniclers, legal clerks, and parish records collectively preserve a society in which obedience was both expected and monitored. Punishment was not arbitrary cruelty. It was a carefully orchestrated mechanism of governance, designed to maintain order, reinforce hierarchy, and transmit the power of the crown across generations. Even as reformers began to question excessive severity, the impact of centuries of structured punishment could not be undone overnight. Philosophers, clerics, and early legal theorists debated whether fear or compassion was the more effective means of maintaining order. Yet these discussions rarely diminish the authority of established practices, which had already become embedded in culture and social expectation. Historical documents show that laws were both rigid and adaptable, allowing the crown to balance visibility, severity, and mercy according to circumstance. Punishment was thus a language through which the monarchy communicated its values, its priorities, and its control over society. Archival evidence also highlights the selective exercise of mercy as an extension of authority. Pardons were granted not purely out of compassion, but to demonstrate the sovereign's ultimate power to give or withhold life, property, and social standing. Letters from Elizabeth I and James I illustrate calculated acts of clemency, timed with coronations, religious observances, or politically significant events. These instances of mercy functioned as lessons in both obedience and gratitude, reinforcing the idea that survival depended upon alignment with the crown's expectations and the favor it could bestow. In effect, forgiveness was another instrument of governance, just as powerful as the harshest sentences. As the centuries progressed, the cumulative effect of these practices shaped societal norms, perceptions of justice, and attitudes toward authority. Fear, ritual, and the anticipation of consequence became internalized, influencing behavior and maintaining order long after the immediate punishment had concluded. The archives preserve this system with chilling clarity. Records of gibbets, lists of transported convicts, court rolls of fines and imprisonments all attest to a meticulously maintained network of discipline. Royal punishment was never random. It was deliberate, strategic, and fully integrated into the governance of the realm. Reflecting on these histories, one realizes that the worst punishments in royal Britain were as much about perception as they were about action. They educated communities, regulated behavior, and maintained the social hierarchy with a precision that was as bureaucratic as it was brutal. The crown's authority was exercised through law, ceremony, and spectacle alike, creating a society where obedience and memory were inseparable. These records endure today not as entertainment, but as testimony to a world in which justice, fear, and authority were intricately entwined. If the history of Old Britain, its laws, and the far-reaching consequences of royal punishments captivates you, you are invited to subscribe and continue exploring these hidden chapters. Share your reflections and thoughts in the comments, and join a community that values deep understanding, historical nuance, and the enduring lessons of the past. The archives may remain silent, but through careful study, their testimony continues to speak across the centuries.